Zero. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for tuning back into Canada Today on Muslim Network TV. You are watching this show with Taha Bayur. I'm your host. After years of state discrimination against religious minorities, the law that has been the actual discrimination series of discriminations that we have witnessed in the Quebec province has now been enshrined into a law with the adoption of Bill 21. The government of Quebec has banned Canadians working in public professions from wearing religious symbols such as crosses, hijabs, turbans, and yarmulkes. Many think that this bill is unconstitutional, arguing that Quebec government is subjecting their political beliefs on Quebecers by forcing people to dress contrary to their own private beliefs. This law discriminates against people currently working in public sector and the youth who aspire to be in those careers. Today, we are happy to be joined by a Canadian writer and journalist and expert on this topic, Idil Issa. She will speak with us on this about this bill, its impact on Muslim women in particular and women in general. And Idil Issa has worked in the startup and not-for-profit sector in Qatar, in Malaysia, South Africa, and in Canada. She writes frequently for outlets such as Globe and Mail, Esquire Malaysia, Colors magazine, as well as Maisonneuve magazine, among others, on issues touching race, religion, and gender. She appears regularly on media outlets such as CBC and CTV to advocate for the rights of the marginalized and oppressed populations, with focus on the intersectional experiences of Muslim women of color. Thank you very much, Idil, for being here with us and sparing some time to be on this show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you for being with us once again. And, a few months back, we had a pretty good discussion with two leaders from Quebec who have been in this space of fighting for rights in different areas and specifically minorities. And we had a pretty good conversation about the legal aspect of Bill 21 as well as its impact. Today, we wanted to hear from you, being a female writer and leader in Quebec, specifically from Montreal, and your perspective as a female Muslim woman, female Muslim who happens to be Black in that area, and its impact on you, as well as, of course, on other individuals in the community. So, for those of our viewers who may not be familiar with Bill 21, can you help us break this down for us? And in a nutshell, what is Bill 21 all about?
Mm-hmm. So thank you for the lovely introduction. And I'd be happy to kind of frame this conversation and give a bit of context in terms of what Bill 21 is. Bill 21 is actually the last in a series of legislative measures in Quebec restricting the rights of Muslim women in particular. So it ends with Bill 21, but it didn't start with Bill 21. We had in Quebec over 10 years ago a proposition or a proposed law called the Charter of Values. And so in that context, it was going to be much more wide sweeping, where civil liberties, in particular religious freedoms, would be severely curtailed. So that law did not pass. It did not go through, thankfully. But it was just the beginning. You know, we had successive propositions. We had Bill 62, which was a law mandating that services provided by the government would be provided with face uncovered. So both the recipient and the person providing the services were to have their faces uncovered. So this, of course, would have a disproportionate effect on women, Muslim women who wear the niqab. And then now we see Bill 21. So Bill 21, in essence, it focuses on people who are representing the state. So this is public prosecutors, this is teachers, and a variety of different professions are targeted. And in essence, Bill 21 says that people who have those jobs, who are in those professions, working for the state, so working for the government of Quebec, cannot have any visible religious symbols. So that would include, a yarmulke, that would include a hijab, that would include a Sikh turban. So of course, this has a very negative effect on religious minorities in Quebec. Of which there are significant numbers. You know, Quebec is a province which has a lot of immigration year to year. There are many people coming to Quebec from what we would call the Maghreb, so Northern Africa and other countries where their religion or their religious identity is not the local religion. So they're not Roman Catholics. So this definitely affects them disproportionately. And it's something that I felt was very necessary to counter. I think that the whole premise of the law, that it's a law protecting the religious neutrality of the state, is a red herring. I don't think that that's what it's really about. I think that, a person who wears a so-called religious symbol is just as able as somebody who doesn't to be a neutral person and to dispense the, their functions or their duties as a member of the state neutrally. I think they can do it impartially. I don't think there's anything about being Muslim that means you are inherently impartial. So yeah, I thought it was very important for people to really rise up and to make sure that this didn't go through, because I think it's a slippery slope. I think once you start to erode these fundamental rights, I mean, what's next? Religious freedoms are enshrined in our Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. And there's a reason for that, because historically, there have been time periods where people were discriminated against because of their religious affiliation. And so I think it's definitely something that needs to be fought in Quebec. And it's something I've been a part of in terms of trying to fight Bill 21. It was voted into law, unfortunately. The current government in Quebec, the Coalition Avenir Québec, has a majority in Parliament. So even if they do not have broad support from the other parties, they are able to push through laws, and they're able to really kind of implement their mandate. So now the current phase of this struggle or this fight against Bill 21 and the erosion of our religious freedoms is a legal challenge. So there are several legal challenges to Bill 21 currently underway. There's 4 that I'm familiar with. And probably one of the reasons why there's so many is that in implementing this law, the government, the Coalition Avenir Québec, used what we call the notwithstanding clause. Yep. So they did this because they understood that the law is discriminatory. It contravenes our Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. It damages our religious liberties. So they use the notwithstanding clause, which is available to provinces when they're legislating. And I think there's a sunset to that. So every 5 years they have to renew it. But what it does, essentially, it tries to head off at the pass any charter challenges to their law. Yep. So they've used this. And so I think lawyers are trying to get a bit creative and trying to find different legal arguments other than the charter to fight this bill.
Well, thank you for that very articulate overview here, and I think you covered a lot of things that I was going to ask you about already. But tell us a little bit about these legal actions right now. I mean, are these all Muslim groups? are these who are these people challenging at this point, who are fighting in courts?
Mhm. I know that the NCCM is part of it, so that's the National Council of Canadian Muslims. So that's
Yeah.
one Muslim lobby group. There's also the Canadian some CCLA. I think it's something Canadian something
Civil liberties, yes. Canadian
exactly, yeah.
civil liberties, yes.
So it's a very prominent Canadian civil liberties organization. Is also part of a legal challenge. There's also several teachers unions in Quebec who are challenging this law, and which I find very positive because I think the government was really counting on a broad support from civil society so that they could say, it's not just us. We have a mandate for this. We have a consensus in Quebec that people like this law. So I think it's a positive thing because teachers unions are made up of not really Muslims. Like we make up a very tiny minority of those groups, and the fact that they're challenging this law is a positive sign to show that it's also just regular Quebecers who are opposed to this law and want to see their colleagues treated fairly. So there are some teachers unions also involved.
Yeah, that's great, and definitely the momentum is growing, which is great to see. Now, tell us a little bit about the current situation on the ground. Particularly after this law was basically it remained unchallenged by, of course, the provincial government and of even the federal government, sadly, so far. What is the bill's status as it is being applied right now in Quebec? Is it being applied in full force? Is it being gradually introduced? How is it impacting people like you, perhaps, who may be wanting to work or maybe already working in public sector in Quebec?
It is having an impact on people on the ground. So I myself work in the private sector. My day job is in the private sector, so I'm not specifically targeted by the bill. But I am aware of many Muslim women who are grievously impacted by this law. So people who are planning to become public prosecutors, people who wrapped up their education degrees at one of the 4 universities in Montreal, for example, and are unable to start their career as teachers. I know of one Sikh woman who had to travel to or move to British Columbia to start teaching because there's just no job opportunities available for her in Quebec. So there's brain drain. There's definitely people unable to start their careers. And of course, some of them graduating from university have significant debt load. So, they're counting on being able to start their career and start to pay that off. It's definitely a negative impact. And unfortunately, from what I've heard, COVID has not really alleviated that situation. The government isn't looking at this, the reality of COVID and the idea that, everyone is covering their faces, delivering services in particular. But that hasn't softened their stance. From what I'm hearing, people are still unable to start their careers. They're unable to get posts with the government based on this law as long as they wear their religious symbol.
That's heartbreaking. I mean, you're a fresh graduate. You have aspirations. You want to start, new adventures in a career, and you want to try new things. And here you are, not only not basically allowed to apply anywhere in these sectors, but you are, on top of that, you have a debt load, as you mentioned. You have anxiety about how I'm going to pay it off. On top of that, you have COVID-19. Sadly, that's of course impacting everybody, and racialized communities in particular are being impacted in a triple the amount perhaps at times because of it. So it's very, very unfortunate and very, very sad that people are not seeing the impact on the mental health and the physical health, perhaps even, and of course the financial health of Canadians who are being directly impacted by this very, very bigoted law. So I wanted to understand from you at this point, how did we get here? I mean, what led to this legislation? You did talk about the precursor. We talked about Bill 62 a bit. You talked about even other series of attempts to legislate such discriminatory practices. But let's talk about the popular opinion. Let's talk about public. What are the sentiments of common people in Montreal, in Quebec, whom you interact with? Are all or most Quebecers in favor of such discriminatory bills? What do you hear from people when you talk about these issues? If when you come across people on these topics?
Mm-hmm. So I won't lie to you. The bill is quite popular in Quebec. There are a lot of Quebecers in support of it. The Coalition Avenir Québec has a majority in the parliament. So they definitely have a mandate. They have support from the public. But I think when it comes to minority rights, that's the whole thing, right? A practice that's very particular to one segment of the population won't necessarily have a broad-based appeal. And that's why we always in a democracy have to protect minority rights, because it's not something that the majority will necessarily always protect and stand behind. So that's why leadership is very important in these situations. Leadership to be able to say, okay, this may not be a practice that's important to you, but because we live in a pluralistic society, in a democracy, we protect these rights so that you as well, whatever practice you have, whatever community you're from, that you also will be protected. So I think that's the key point. Is it doesn't necessarily matter if it's very popular or not in Quebec. I think what matters is the underlying principle of respect for minority rights, respect for a pluralistic society, and to maintain a healthy democracy. And I think those are the things that the CAQ is really trying to erode. They're starting to scale back, or trying to scale back funding for English institutions in Quebec. There's definitely a drive or a momentum to reshape Quebec in the image of the Coalition Avenir Québec. So, that's what we're fighting against, is this idea that somehow to be, a strong Quebec, minority rights need to be infringed upon.
You're right. That's excellent. Thank you very much for sharing that. So what I wanted to also discuss with you and hear a little bit from you about is the impact, of course, on and the targeting of Muslims in particular. There are several, of course, social experts out there, even testimonies that really clearly indicate that as much as it targets, of course, as much as it impacts other religious minorities out there in Quebec, it was very much targeting the Muslim women in particular. Do you find this assertion to be true or accurate from your perspective? Do you think this is a very much of a Islamophobic bill that is clearly targeting Muslim women who are wearing hijab?
I do feel it is. The genesis of a lot of these debates was actually requests for religious accommodation many years ago. And in our society, our government, our courts have very good ways of dealing with requests for accommodation, reasonable accommodation. And unfortunately, some of those requests were sensationalized, politicized, and that's when it really became or transformed into a debate about religious neutrality, or laïcité, as we called it in French. So initially, the argument for laïcité or religious neutrality wasn't really present in these debates. So it's really been politicized. Bill 21, it says that it's a law to respect laïcité or religious neutrality, as though somehow by wearing a scarf, a Muslim woman is disrespecting religious neutrality. She could be a very staunch proponent of the separation of church and state. For all we know, the hijab has more likely to do with other reasons, but it's definitely been politicized, unfortunately. Yeah, but sorry, please elaborate on your question. I want to provide a more full answer.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you answered partly that question anyway, but the point was that, I mean, do you think this law is directly impacting, not directly impacting, but directly targeted at, intended at Canadian Muslim or Quebec Muslim women who observe hijab, even though, of course, it is, it covers all religious symbols, and of course, it's impacting. We know of Sikh women and men who are leaving Quebec province, and of course Montreal, Quebec City, which is where a lot of the government jobs are. So of course, it's obviously impacting other communities as well. But the original intent, going back to the issue of niqab, for instance, I think the patterns are quite clear. And I was wondering if you thought, of course, and you did answer, that whether it is a very Islamophobic, oriented and intended bill, of course.
Mm-hmm. So in all of my interventions, like in interviews about Bill 21 and different speeches I've made, I do tend to focus on the disproportionate impact these laws have on Muslim women, because I think it's quite severe for Muslim women in particular. For example, a Muslim man could present himself in a way that it wasn't necessarily very obvious on first glance that he is a Muslim. Whereas for many Muslim women, it's a very visible symbol.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also important to remember to make common cause with some of the other religious minorities affected by these laws. So that's Jewish people, that's Sikhs. A lot of other religious minorities are affected by the bill. And partnering with those religious minorities to fight the bill is positive, I think.
Yeah, very true, very true. Now, why do you think the law has not been opposed yet by the federal government in the way it should have been? I mean, yes, there have been election promises made. We have heard that the federal government is going to intervene in some way, and it supports the rights of religious freedom and minorities in Quebec and and for all Canadians. But yet we have seen a lot of reluctance and hardly any action from the federal government. Why do you think it's taking so long?
I think there are certain electoral politics at play. There's one famous by-election in Quebec that the NDP lost, and people really felt it was because of their stance on the so-called niqab ban. So by taking a public stance to support women who wear the niqab, people felt that they took an electoral loss in Quebec for that reason. So political parties since then have been a bit shy about really coming out publicly to support this cause. Quebec is a very important province in terms of federal elections and the number of votes that parties need to get in Quebec in order to win elections. So it's a very sensitive thing for political parties at the federal level to get involved in this particular debate, which is unfortunate because at the end of the day, there's a principle at stake, and they really should come out publicly and forcefully. It's just not the reality, though. On the ground, parties are shy to get involved.
That's unfortunate, and this is what I think this is one of the sort of struggles and the campaigns also at this point behind whether it's from NCCM or other civil liberties organizations, and that is really to push our MPs and our members of parliament to first of all recognize that there is a serious level of discrimination happening here, which is disproportionately impacting religious minorities, and then of course doing something about it. And statements are important. That's always the first step, and it's a start, but we need definitely a lot more action on these things. Now, I think you touched upon, interestingly, you right at the beginning, you talked about some of the flaws, I guess, or the flaws with this bill, which is why, of course, the way it was introduced was that you have a sunset clause for 5 years, but notwithstanding clause is basically pretty much remains unchallenged. And of course, now they're trying, and civil rights groups are trying to challenge it in creative ways. But first of all, help us understand from your perspective, what makes Bill 21 unconstitutional?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't be able to provide a legal opinion on that. I'm not a trained lawyer. I'm an advocate and a writer and a speaker. So I can provide a perspective from that perspective, not a legal opinion.
Mm-hmm.
It's in our Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. We do have religious freedoms in Canada. And, Quebec, although sometimes it likes to pretend otherwise, is part of Canada. And so not only that, in Quebec, we also have our own charter. So it's a charter which is very similar to the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. And religious liberties are also enshrined in the Quebec Charter, so the provincial charter. So this is kind of an inconvenient fact that a lot of politicians in Quebec like to gloss over. They really do like to frame the debate like it's some religious minority asking for things, special treatment, for example. So I think it's important that we always refer back to the laws of the land. This is something that is part of Quebec legal tradition. It's part of Canadian legal tradition. It's not a special privilege that Muslims are asking for. We're really just asking to be treated like everyone else. And I think it's very important that we stand on that ground. I do think it is a slippery slope. If we do allow this, it's not going to be good, not only for Muslim minorities or other religious minorities, but for society as a whole. Like I remember, studying and going to school and primary school, high school, and learning in school about time periods where, for example, Black people or Jewish people were not allowed to be to study at certain institutions or universities. And now I'm talking about like McGill University, very famous universities in Canada. And so, I always learned that in textbooks as, part of our dark past, our bad history. And so I never really thought I would see a day where we would literally have the same sort of law where people are restricted from entering certain professions on the basis of their religious confession. So I think it's a very bad precedent. I think it's something that we need to understand fully of what's happening in terms of, the idea that we're treating a class of citizens as less than, and I think that's a very sad situation for us in Canada.
Absolutely, and definitely a very dangerous precedent for rest of Canada, unfortunately. So we definitely have to do our part to fight it with all the legal and civil means, of course. Let's come to talk a little bit about your efforts in this area and your sort of your vocal efforts here. I know you have in the past spoken against Bill 62. You've called it something that doesn't make sense. It's basically useless, and you use pen, the power of pen for impact, and you talk about contentious and sensitive issues like these all the time. What has been public's response, and even media's, I guess, media in general, media's response to your literary efforts in this area, your journalistic efforts, when you write about such issues? What kinds of reactions are you getting from Quebecers and maybe even fellow media personnel?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say, to echo what I think a lot of people already kind of guess, is there is a bit of a divide between my reception in English media versus French media.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a sort of cultural, how can I put this? In Canada, we have what we call two solitudes, right? So there's English Canada and then there's French Canada.
Yes.
This is the most pessimistic view of things, of course, but in some ways it holds true. So, you know, within discourse in French in Quebec, you know, there's this idea of anything criticizing the government is Quebec bashing, right? So, and this is very convenient for the government, right? Coalition Avenir Québec would just love for people to conflate them with Quebec, because then they have the whole province behind them. They can say, well, they're attacking the Coalition Avenir Québec, so that means they're attacking Quebec, which is of course not the case at all. I love Quebec, which is why I live here. I much prefer it to Ottawa or Toronto. So, so yeah, I think they've used that to their advantage, and unfortunately, it's been a narrative that's really caught on, and it's something that makes it hard to translate the message against Bill 21 in French media. I've had some success, you know, especially in news reportage, so less editorials, but you know, French media outlets will cover me and what I'm saying about Bill 21 as part of their news items. In English, I've had a much more success in terms of getting my editorials published on Bill 21. But in a way, it's like preaching to the choir, right? A lot of people in English Canada are already opposed to Bill 21. They have a level of awareness about it. And so in a way, I feel like it's less effective. You know, my message is getting through, but it would be much more impactful if I was able to do that in the French media. Working on that, but that's kind of how I see it.
You'll get there, inshallah. Well, that's great. You know, you're on the board of Parole des Femmes, an organization that helps to promote women writers and voices of women in public sphere. Why is it so important for you to be in such forums and on such boards?
Yeah, Parole des Femmes is an initiative that was founded by Dalila Awada, who is quite a very important figure here in Quebec. She's a Muslim woman who actually won a very important legal battle against, you know, in terms of defamation, dealing with online trolls and that sort of thing. So she's quite an important figure in terms of the fight against Islamophobia in Quebec. She's founded the organization, and yes, I've been lucky to be able to be the vice president of the organization. It's an organization that aims to create spaces for women in Quebec, in particular women living at the intersections of different marginalized identities. So, you know, sometimes we'll do workshops, media training. We will host events, open mic nights, just different spaces to help women find their voice in Quebec.
Awesome. That's great. Well, let's, as we conclude next few minutes, I have a couple of questions specifically, and one being to do regarding, you know, those of us who are common people who probably don't know much about what's happening with Quebec, you know, and with Bill 21 as Canadians, and we're learning more about it. And yes, we want to do something hopefully about it, especially after listening to you. What are top 3 things that civil society and Canadian Muslims in particular do to push back on Bill 21?
Okay, so I would say the first thing you can do is to support the legal challenges. So whether that's donating, whichever means you have to identify some of the legal challenges currently being underway against Bill 21. Second, I would say try to lobby your local officials. You know, Quebec is not an island as much as it would like to be. It's part of a federation. Canada is a federation of provinces and territories. And so as such, our premier has to go to meetings with other premiers, you know, the premier of Manitoba, of Alberta, et cetera, et cetera. They all sit at meetings from time to time. So I think it's important to really lobby your local politicians. So whether that's your MP, whether that's your premier, send messages, send emails to those offices and tell them you're against Bill 21. And the next time they get into one of these meetings with the premiers and the Prime Minister of Canada to mention that. I think, was it the Premier of Saskatchewan, I want to say, who's already made his opposition to Bill 21 public. And that helps. That definitely helps, because what you don't want is you don't want a monolith. You don't want there to be no premiers publicly speaking out against Bill 21. So I would say that's the second thing you could do. And then third, I would say think about social cohesion. I think in some of these debates, they can get very fractious. It's a very personal issue. I, as a Muslim woman, it's very personal to me. So, I definitely do feel a level of anger about this law. But I think it's important while you're fighting these discriminatory bills to find common cause with your fellow Canadians. I think that division is not helpful. And at the end of the day, we all live in a society together and we want to live peaceably and harmoniously together. So I think fight the bill, but don't fight each other. Make sure that you're maintaining social cohesion.
Great advice. Thank you so much. The last question I wanted to ask you is actually something what you sort of just referred to, and that is, the personal impact and the anger and the anguish that comes with, of course, such discriminatory and bigoted legislations. What advice do you have for Muslim women who are being impacted by this bill very directly in Quebec? Muslim women, or women, of course, who are men and women even, of course, who are being impacted because of the ban on religious symbols in public spaces. What advice do you have for them in terms of coping with such challenges, while hopefully, something there may be a breakthrough in terms of legal, action at some point, maybe, God knows, maybe a couple of years, few years down the road. But, we have to be prepared. It could be a long-term thing, could be a short-term thing. We do our best to fight it. What advice do you have for those who are at this point experiencing such difficulties in such circumstances?
It is very difficult, and I'm not getting the worst of it. Of course, I'm not in the teaching profession. So I would say for people in that position, definitely reach out to your community members. I think it's a time to come together and to help each other. I myself created an organization or a Facebook group called Muslim Women Organizing Against Racism and Islamophobia. And through that group, we've been able to connect and to help each other and to feel less alone through all of this, because it is very difficult, in particular for people who are directly impacted. So I'd say reach out to each other, help each other through this, and try to keep, it's difficult, but try to keep your spirits up, keep, empowering yourself. Maybe it's a matter of doing another degree while you're waiting for these legal challenges to reach the end of their term. But try to connect with each other, help each other out, and then always reach for the stars. I think bills like this try to just derail you in life, and I think that don't let it derail you. Especially for Muslim women, I'm speaking to them right now, is you can achieve anything, and just because the state says that this profession is not for you doesn't mean that that's the truth. So don't let this derail you from your ambitions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Idil, for very, very inspirational and insightful conversation here, and for your courage. Of course, this is not a topic that's easy for impacted people, of course, like you, in such places to be talking about. So thank you for your voice, and thank you for being a vocal leader in this area. So really appreciate your time today on Canada Today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, folks, you have heard this afternoon Idil Issa, who is a journalist, who's a writer, who's been vocal on these issues of Bill 21 and other discriminatory and Islamophobic practices in Quebec in particular. I wanted to end with a quote that I've always find very inspiring by Martin Luther King Jr. The trailblazers in human, academic, scientific, and religious freedom have always been non-conformists. So we want you to be a non-conformist and do the right thing by standing up for principles of fairness and justice, wherever is needed, and of course in civil manner, so that we can restore the rights for everyone in our city, in our province, in our country, for everybody. So we have learned a lot today about this Bill 21 law, and now it's time for us to take action. And you've heard some of the things you can do to support legal actions, to talking to your MPs, to writing about it, and sharing your concerns with our allies, and work with them in solidarity. So once again, thank you very much for joining Canada Today on Muslim Network TV. This is Taha Ghayur, and we'd like to also thank at the end our supporters and our viewers, and we want to always hear from you on ideas, potential ideas for the show. So please keep writing to us and sharing your thoughts. And I want to thank our producers today, Saleha Farouk, as well as Aisha Malik, and of course our community partners, media partners, CanadaMuslim.com, as well as Dawanet. Once again, signing off, Taha Ghayur. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.